Welcome to our first lecture for the course. We're going to be starting off with our introduction to the NEC. For this lecture, we're going to be doing a review of Article 90, Article 100, and the index. So our lesson objectives for this lecture, we're going to understand the purpose, scope, and necessity for the NEC. We're going to identify separate chapters of the code and understand the correct method of referencing articles. Identify differences between mandatory rules, permissive rules, and explanatory material. And we're going to use the index to successfully look up NEC articles and content. And our definitions, we're going to be talking about an AHJ. This is the NEC definition of an AHJ. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to it. Mandatory, permissive, and provisions. And we'll be explaining a little bit more about these terms as we come to them during the lecture. So starting off here, we're going to be starting with Article 90, which is definition. To be exact, for Article 90, this is actually going to be the very first page of your code book. I strongly encourage, as we work through these lectures, that you follow along in your code book. So if you're doing so, once you open the cover page of your NEC, this is going to be the very first page where you see at the top NFPA 70 National Electrical Code, and below that will be whether you're in the 2017 or 2020 edition of the code. So a couple key notes about the information on this page. The NEC is published by the National Electrical Code Committee, and it's sponsored by the National Fire Protection Association, which is NFPA. The first code was written in 1887. It's been sponsored by NFPA since 1911. And the purpose of the National Electrical Code is to protect individuals and property from hazards resulting from the use of electricity. This is an important note. We'll talk about this a little bit more in our next couple slides. The NEC is not meant to be an installation guide or an instruction manual or a how-to reference. The sole purpose of this book is just to ensure that electrical installations are done in a safe and hazard-free way. And to reiterate that point, we have a bullet here, not intended as a design guide or instruction manual for untrained people. Minimum. A quick note about the way these lectures are going to be presented. You can see here on this bold point about the purpose of National Electrical Code. At the end of that, we have a 90.1. So this indicates where that piece of information came from in the code. I'll be talking a little bit more as we work our way through this slide about how the code is broken down and how to actually, what the different numbers and whatnot in it mean. But for this bullet point, we would have now moved on to page 30 is where we would be at now. To understand what page you're on, this works for those of you that have ever used a phone book, very similar to a phone book. If you just open your book to a random page and look in the bottom left and right hand corners of the pages, you'll see a 70 dash and then a number. That number, the secondary number, is what page you are actually on currently. The 70 indicates that this is NFPA 70. The National Fire Protection Association writes a large variety of books, and this is book number 70 that they write. So you should be currently on the page with bottom left corner would be 70-30 if you're in a 2017 edition of your book. And on that page, you should see in bold Article 90 Introduction. This 90.1 correlates to this 90.1 purpose point here. So the information on the slide would come from somewhere in that text below that. Moving on from there, we're going to be taking a look now at the scope of the NEC. So this means what all does this code book include? What does it cover? What does it talk about? So the NEC covers the installation and the removal of all of the following. And once again, this is per 9E.2A. So if you're following along in your book, if you look at 9E.2, you'll see scope. And below that, you will see an A that says covered. So we are in what you would call 9E.2A covered right now is the source for this. What I've done essentially, and the way all these lectures for the course will work, is I select out the relevant information or kind of word it in a better way than the code as to the important parts of the different articles. So essentially, this is a summary of the information of 9E.2A, kind of the important parts. So it covers the installation and removal of electrical conductors, equipment, and raceways, signaling and communication conductors, equipment, and raceways, fiber optical cables, and it does so in the following areas. So all these items, when they are in one of the areas listed here: public and private premises, buildings and structures, mobile homes, recreational vehicles, yards and lots, parking, that is, carnivals, industrial establishments, and all installations used by the electrical utility that are not integral part of the generating plant, substation, or control center. So essentially, with this utility, electric utility point, you can think of this as such as one of their office buildings or something like that. It's not part of the actual power grid. So once again, the top part, the 9E.2, under installation and removal of the following, all of those items in all of these areas listed below. And also the installation supplying shore power to ships and watercraft and marinas and boatyards. Now we're going to be taking a look at not covered. So these items are things that the NEC does not have jurisdiction over. The rules in the NEC don't apply to it. It does not talk about them. So all of the following, and this is going to be 9E.2B. Ships and watercraft other than floating buildings, railway rolling stock, aircraft, and automotive vehicles other than mobile homes and recreational vehicles, installations underground in mines and self-propelled mobile surface mining machinery, and railways, generation, transformation, transmission, energy storage, or distribution of power used exclusively for rolling stock or signaling communications. Essentially, the way I summarize this is if it's in a mine or if it's in the water or if the electric utility uses it to distribute power, the NEC does not cover it. That's kind of a very inclusive way of summarizing the not covered scope of the NEC. And also communication equipment under the exclusive control of the communications utility. So once again, something the communication utility uses to distribute their service. And here was the bullet point mentioned already about installations under the exclusive control of the electrical utility under certain circumstances, such as for the power distribution. All right, so now we're going to be talking just a little bit more about the arrangement of the NEC, how it's laid out, get a little bit more into how to actually reference it. Now that we kind of have an understanding of what the NEC is, what it covers, what it talks about. Now we're actually going to be taking a look at how you go about referencing it. So the NEC is divided into 9 separate chapters, and these are actually called chapters in the NEC. So our chapters 1 through 4 apply generally. So this means across all fields that the NEC covers, the rules of chapters 1 through 4 are going to apply to all those installations. They apply across the board without exception. Chapters 5 through 7 are what we call special conditions and can change or supplement the requirements of 1 through 4. So for an example of this, if we're talking about a swimming pools are covered in Article 680, which is Chapter 6 of the NEC. The rules specific to swimming pools that are found in Chapter 6 can actually change or add to the rules of the related information in chapters 1 through 4. So additionally, it's an add-on or an altercation of chapters 1 through 4. But once again, chapters 1 through 4 apply to all situations. Chapter 8 covers communication systems, and for this particular chapter, the requirements of 1 through 7 do not apply. We usually refer to chapter 8 as a standalone chapter. You could, in theory, pull chapter 8 out of the NEC and make it its own code, its own book, because it does not tie into or relate to the rest of the NEC at all. And chapter 9 just consists of reference tables. There's not actually rules and codes in chapter 9. It's more of just an informational resource. Now, an important note to know is that in this course, where for the 99%, we're only going to be talking about chapters 1 through 4. This is because once you learn to use the NEC in general, and you learn the chapter 1 through 4 rules, you learn how the NEC is laid out, and kind of the base information that's covered in 1 through 4, so things like conductors, calculations, conduit sizing, pull box sizing, grounding and bonding, all this general information, you can take that information and very easily learn specific rules of 5 through 7. And in addition to that, I have no way of knowing what specific careers or fields anyone in this course is going to go into after they graduate. And since 5 through 7 apply to specific occupations, it wouldn't be beneficial to a lot of my students to go over every single specific situation. You know, for someone that's going to be working in a commercial garage, it's not going to be helpful for us to go over hospitals. And for someone that's going to be working in a marina, that's also not going to be beneficial. So once you learn the 1 through 4 general that we cover in this course, and you decide what specific field you're going to go into, you can use that baseline of knowledge to apply it to that specific occupation. And we also have informative annexes, but they're not considered part of the requirements, and they're for information only. Kind of similar to chapter 9 in that they're just there for our use and benefit. So now we're going to dig a little bit more into the specific descriptions. Chapters 1 through 4, we're going to be doing the same for 5 through 9, but we're going to be starting off with chapter 1 through 4. So chapter 1 covers just general information. So primarily it talks about definitions and safety. Some of the specific information found in it, so you can find information regarding equipment markings, working spaces, enclosure selection, and guarding. A note to keep in mind as we talk through chapters 1 and 4 through 4 is that we often relate these to a job site, to a new construction building. For those of you who have taken any courses over that or have experience in that, typically when we're looking at constructing a new building, the first thing we start looking at is we look at what safety measures we're going to have to put in place. We look at our legal definitions, things like that, before we start planning for the rest of the job. And chapters 1 through 4 kind of follow the process of how we would build a job site. Because once again, as I said, usually we start by looking at legal definitions, worker safety, things like that. Then we move on to chapter 2, which is wiring and protection, planning and layout. So with this article, or with this chapter rather, some of the specific information is going to be circuits and feeders, service calculations, overcurrent protection, and grounding and bonding. So once again, after we kind of laid out, you know, all of our legal documents, our safety, all that, we move on to doing some load calculations on the building to determine, you know, what kind of service are we going to need, how are we going to ground and bond this building, what kind of overcurrent protection are we going to need, how big of feeders are we going to need to the different pieces of equipment, things like that. Then once we have that, we move on to chapter 3, which is wiring methods and materials, which we kind of associate with the rough end phase of a project. So Chapter 3 is going to include things such as conductors, box fill, cable and conduit, busway, cable tray. So once we've calculated how big of equipment and pieces and parts we need to do a job with, then we start doing the rough end, which is where we're going to be running conduit and conductors to different pieces of equipment. We're going to be installing cable tray to run tray cable in. We're going to be needing size device boxes, things like that. And then finally, we would move on to Chapter 4, which is equipment for general use. Once again, chapters 1 through 4 being general, which we associate with the trim out phase of a job. So this includes things such as switches, receptacles, panel boards, luminaires, motors, generators, and transformers. So once again, after we've done our rough end stage, we have conduit and conductors to everything. Then we would go back in and start installing those finished products. So we install our light fixtures, switches, receptacles. We're trimming out panels. We have motors start coming on, transformers that start getting energized, and so on. So like I said, chapters 1 through 4 apply pretty much across the board to any type of building you can think of. You're always going to have safety requirements. You're always going to have services and grounding and bonding. You're always going to have some type of conductors or cable to energize utilization equipment with, and you're always going to have some type of utilization equipment itself. Moving on, we're going to be taking a look at chapters 5 through 8 now. Once again, chapters 5 through 8, 5 through 7 apply generally, and then chapter 8 is a standalone chapter on its own. So each of these are going to be somewhat specific and kind of situational. So chapter 5 applies to special occupancies. And we're going to be repeating the word special when talking about 5 through 7 quite frequently. Occupancies meaning special locations. So some examples of this, we have hazardous locations, commercial garages, healthcare facilities, marinas and boat yards, and temporary installations. So essentially chapter 5 boils down to what type of building are you working in. Obviously, if we're just working in a retail store or something like that, that's nothing special. There's nothing special going into that building. However, working in a healthcare facility, for example, we have a lot of specific requirements for patient bedside receptacles, for emergency power, for life safety power, things like that. A lot of very specific requirements for that type of building. Chapter 6 is going to cover special equipment. Equipment being pretty self-explanatory, includes things like signs, elevators, swimming pools, solar photovoltaic systems, and fire pumps. So once again, a special piece of equipment. So if you think about this in terms of is it special, it is, does every building have it? So not every building is going to have a swimming pool in it. Not every building is going to have an elevator. Not every building is going to have a fire pump or solar power, things like that. And chapter 7 is going to cover special conditions. Some examples of this being emergency, optional standby, signaling circuits, and fire alarm systems. So once again, not every building is going to have these types of systems in it, but if those systems are present, we have very specific and very special circumstances we have to take into account on those. And as we had said previously, chapter 8 covers communication systems. This is going to include radio and television equipment, cat cabling, and broadband communications. So in your NEC, if you're following along, you should see this table. If you're in the 2017, this is going to be in the top right corner of page 31. And this is kind of a breakdown of what we just talked about. So you can see up here at the top, chapters 1 through 4 apply generally to all electrical installations. Chapters 5 through 7 supplement or add to. Chapters 1 through 4 and chapter 8, communications, is not subject to the requirements of chapters 1 through 7, except where the requirements are specifically referenced in chapter 8. Chapter 9 is only applicable as referenced, and once again, our informative annexes are not actual rules, they're only for information's sake. So now we've kind of discussed the applications, the code, where it's applicable. We've kind of talked about how it's broken down into these different chapters. So now we're going to talk about the actual enforcement of the code. So this is the method by which the rules of the code are enforced and applied to different industries. So the NEC must be adopted by a local authority or municipality for application. What this means is that when NFPA releases a copy of the code, so for instance, last year, 2020, this being recorded in 2021 currently, NFPA released the 2020 edition of the NEC, which some of you in this course may be using currently. However, Kentucky, as of the time of this video recording, this lecture, is still on the 2017 edition of the code as a state. So the state at large has what's known as adopted the code, which means they have said we are going to require electrical installations in our state to follow the rules and requirements that are in this document being the 2017 edition of the NEC. Up until now, we have not moved on to the 2020 edition of the code, meaning that any rules or additions that have been set forth in the 2020 code are not enforceable to electrical installations in the state of Kentucky. Now notice the wording of this of local authorities, municipalities. So what this means is that individual cities and counties in different states have the authority to adopt different versions of the code. So even though Kentucky as a whole has not adopted the 2020 edition of the code, a local county or city, so for instance, the city of Bowling Green or the city of Lexington, has the authority to say we are going to adopt the 2020 edition of the code and now make it an enforceable legal document. In addition to this, the authorities and municipalities that adopt the code can make amendments to the code. So what this means is that they can say a specific rule in the code they don't agree with and either not make it enforceable, or they can say it's not strict enough and make even stricter requirements. So for instance, the code, the NEC, the 2017-2020 edition of the code, when talking about a grounding electrode conductor for ground rods, and you may or may not know what this is at this point in this course, this is just a quick example of how this would work, states that you cannot be required to use a conductor larger than a number 6 AWG copper conductor for attachment to ground rods when ground rods are used as the primary grounding electrode. The state or municipality, however, would have the authority to say, you know, we think a number 6 is too large of a conductor. It's not necessary. We're going to reduce that to a number 8 conductor. And vice versa of that, they could also say, we don't think a number 6 is big enough. We're going to require you to use a number 4 conductor. This is often seen with electric utilities in that they will require rules above and beyond the NEC for their installations. And we see that interpretations of rules and approval of materials and equipment are up to the AHJ, or the authority having jurisdiction. Now, the majority of the time that we deal with an AHJ, it's going to be in the form of an electrical inspector. And electrical inspectors in the state of Kentucky are required to be contracted with and approved by the local municipality or the local authority, meaning it is up to the AHJ to enforce the local municipality's rules and requirements for that electrical installation when they do that inspection. And the AHJ, as we said about the municipality itself, has the right and ability to waive specific requirements or permit the use of alternate materials. So in other words, if an AHJ feels that an installation, for example, Even though it meets code, that specific installation is not safe or done in a practical manner. They can still require it to be done in a different way than the minimum set forth by the code. That's an important note that I usually mention before now, but the code, the NEC, is a minimum installation requirement. You cannot go below the code, but you can always install above the code. So for that earlier example I referenced, even though the code says you do not have to use a grounding electroconductor larger than a number 6 for attachment to ground rods, as when they are used as a grounding electrode, there is no rule against using a larger conductor. You could use a number 1 conductor if you wanted to, but you have to use, at a minimum, a certain size conductor, which could be a number 8, it could be a number 6, or so on and so forth. So just to reiterate, the code, the NEC, is a minimum rule. You can always go above the code. So this that we have here, this is an example of what an amendment to the code would look like. So you can see on the top left hand side here of the left page, you can see it that this is by the City Council of the City of Austin, in which they released a set of amendments to the code. Looking at the pages at the bottom, you can see this is 28 pages long, this particular document. So this is just a small clip-it, an example of what that may look like. You can see down here on the B note on the left side, they provide a list of all the amendments to the code they've done. So you can see all the different sections they have altered or deleted in this amendment document. Next, we're going to be taking a look at the types of rules that are in the NEC. The NEC has 2 different types of rules that we'll be talking about. The first of which, so as I said, have 2 different kinds of rules. The first of which is going to be a mandatory rule. So as the word mandatory implies, these rules are specifically required or prohibited, and they include the terms shall or shall not. So essentially, if a rule is a mandatory rule, you have to do specifically what that code says. So for instance, if the NEC mandates that you shall be required to secure a conduit a certain distance from a pull box, you are required to support it within that distance of that pull box. It is not optional. That being leading into the other type of rule we have, which is a permissive rule. Permissive rules are actions that are allowed but not required. They normally describe options or alternative methods. They include the terms shall be permitted or shall not be permitted, not be required. This meaning, if you see this, typically as it says here, this is going to be a alternate installation method to the mandatory rule. So kind of a plan B if you don't want to follow the original rule specified in the mandatory. So in that situation, you'd have the option of the original mandatory rule or the permissive rule in that particular situation. And then we also have explanatory materials such as references to other codes or related information, and these are not enforceable. So as I had mentioned earlier, NFPA writes a variety of other codes. They write, for instance, the industrial codes. They write fire alarm codes, communication codes, life safety codes, and occasionally in NFPA 70, National Electrical Code, they will make references to rules in those codes for information's sake. Where it does that, those are not enforceable or applicable to that electrical installation. They're only there for knowledge. So that kind of wraps up what we're going to be talking about with Article 90. of the NEC. Now we're going to be moving on to Article 100, which is going to be definitions. We're going to talk about this very briefly. Article 100 starting on page 35 of your code book if you're in the 2017. And note that anytime I provide page numbers or where information is specifically on a page, I will be referencing the 2017 code. That's because, as I'd mentioned previously in talking about municipalities adopting codes, this course is written with the assumption that students taking it are in Kentucky, meaning that we are currently on the 2017 code. So if you go to take a journeyman or a master electrical exam in order to acquire a license, that is the code you will be using to take that test. So that is the baseline of what I structure my lectures and course information on. But back to Article 100 here. Article 100 contains definitions essential to using the code and that are used in 2 or more articles. So once again, to stress, the code, the NEC is not an instruction manual. It is not for people that have no experience in the electrical field. The code kind of assumes that you have experience in the field and that you are somewhat competent in basic electrical knowledge. So they do not list basic electrical terms and definitions in Article 100. For instance, they don't provide a definition of what a volt is or what an amp is. Primarily, as it says here, they only provide definitions for where they use terms multiple times in the code. So the definitions in Article 100 are going to be organized alphabetically from A to Z. As I'd said, it does not define general terms or commonly defined technical terms, and it is divided into 3 separate parts. This is the first time I've mentioned parts in this course, so a quick explanation of that. We previously talked about how the NEC is broken down into 9 chapters. Now, each chapter is then further broken down into articles. We've talked about Article 90 and Article 100. You can identify what chapter an article belongs to by the first number in the article. So for instance, Article 250 would belong to Chapter 2 since it starts with 2. Article 300 would belong to Chapter 3 since it starts with a 3. And Article 430 would belong to Chapter 4 since it starts with a 4. Beyond that, each article is broken down into what are called parts, and these are identified with Roman numerals. So for instance, if you are following along in your book, you're looking at page 33 for definitions, you'll see on the left-hand side of the page towards the start, you will see Part 1, General, meaning all the information below that bullet point is going to fall into Part 1 of Article 100. The parts being, Part 1 contains definitions that apply where used in the code. Part 2 contains definitions for equipment installations over 1,000. And we're not going to really worry about addressing Part 3 because it's not going to be applicable to what we talk about in this course. A quick note I will mention, though, is that Part 2 we had about over 1,000 volts. It's very common throughout the entire code that anytime we have installations where there can be under 1,000 volts and less and over 1,000 volts, the code will break that into 2 different sections. And that's a very important note to consider because as you begin having to reference the code to find the answers to questions on your exams and on your test, it's very easy to be looking up an answer in the over 1,000 volts section when in fact the question relates to under 1,000 volts. And we'll be seeing examples of that as we move through the course. So this is an example of what Article 100 looks like. These are a couple pages from Article 100, and you can pretty clearly see here that these are in bold going to be the word being provided the definition for, and beside of it is going to be the actual definition to the word. Like I said, very easy and simple to use. And then lastly, for this lecture, we're going to be talking about the index. So the index starts in a 2017 edition of the code on page 820. So this is all the way in the back of your book, and I know it seems kind of strange to be jumping from the front of the book to the back of the book. However, the index is best learned at the start of learning about the code, as it can be extremely helpful in your journey through learning the code. So the index is a list of terms used in the NEC. So the vast majority of terms the NEC uses and references are going to be listed here in the index. Once again, it's organized alphabetically A to Z, and you're typically going to be using the index to look up which articles in the NEC specific words are used. So for instance, if you're trying to find information on cranes, you could go to the index, go to the C words, and then find cranes. And this would, underneath of cranes, it would list every article that talks about cranes. So that can point you to the direction of what you're trying to find when you're not very familiar with what articles contain what type of information. Here we have the example pages, the first two pages of the index, and you can see, so for example, if we look at aircraft hangars on our page 821 on the left-hand side towards the bottom, we see that aircraft hangars themselves are covered by Article 513 of the NEC. So if we wanted information about an aircraft hangar, we could now just go to Article 513 without having to flip through the whole NEC trying to find where aircraft hangars were covered by. So once again, this can be very helpful and very useful for when you're first learning the NEC. So as I said, this wraps up our very first lecture of the course. In our next session, we're going to be talking about Article 110 and the general requirements of Article 110.